Hello and welcome to Restoration DIY. It's great to have you here and I hope you enjoy the video. In this episode I'll be making a segmented bowl with a Crackle paint effect finish. This is something I've been planning for a while and it didn't disappoint. So without further ado, let's get into it. By way of a change, I decided to start this one on the table saw. I'm cutting lengths of sapele down into 25 by 50mm strips. These are for the segments, and I'm hoping the sizes will be more consistent doing it this way, as opposed to doing it on the bandsaw. And in case you're wondering, my fingers are nowhere near that close to the blade. The camera foreshortens the view. The table saw gave really good results, as it should. The sizes were more consistent and the cut lengths were a lot straighter. Next to be cut were some thinner strips. These are for a couple of feature rings. I was unsure how the ring would look, so I cut extra, so I had some options. Then it was on to cutting the segments for the segmented rings. There's 5 sapele rings and 2 maple rings, each with 12 segments, so 84 in total. The 2 feature rings will come up later. I won't show all 84 being cut, but when they were done, it was over to the drum sander to clean up and reduce the thickness of the feature ring strips. I deliberately cut them on the thick side, knowing I was going to do this bit. I wanted the strips to end up at around 4mm thick. It didn't have to be a dead-on measurement, so long as all the pieces were the same size. Then it was on to gluing up the maple rings. The sapele rings are having epoxy resin joints. The thing to remember when doing this is to use plenty of glue. The end grain will soak it up and you don't want any joints to fail. Once all the segments are arranged in a circle, I use a hose clamp to apply pressure and tighten the joints, making sure the ring is flat and all the segments are level with each other. The second ring was assembled in the same way and both were left overnight to cure. Rings done, next I had to glue the strips of sapele and maple together. In the end I went with 2 pieces of maple, sandwiching a piece of sapele. A generous amount of Type Bond 2 was applied to 2 faces of the timber, then the 3 pieces were stacked on top of each other. This was repeated to create a second identical piece, and then I used a number of clamps to squeeze the joints nice and tight. Just one of these was enough, but I'll be doing a lot more segmented work with more intricate designs, so this will definitely get used on an upcoming project. It's the next day and the glue was set up, but not without a couple of issues. First, the glue has bonded everything together, but with a bit of work I managed to pull them apart. And secondly, the strips have slid out of alignment. Not the end of the world, but I'll have to do a bit of work to clean them up. The easiest way to clean them up was to pass the pieces through the bandsaw and cut away the uneven edges. Done, I cut the segments for the last two rings. In the end I decided to create a hit and miss pattern, so I also cut a piece of maple so I could cut 12 plain and 12 layered segments. With 6 of each segments lined up, I applied the glue and arranged them in a hit and miss pattern, and as before, a hose clamp applied the required pressure to squeeze the joints. This was repeated and the 2 rings were left to cure. The next job was to build the segmented base and rim, but a bit of preparation first. Each segment was sanded to remove the fluffy edges left over from the table saw. Then a layer of lacquer was applied to seal the surface. This stops the segment soaking up the epoxy resin, giving a nice clean edge in the finished piece. Done, I built the segmented base and rim using the 3D printed spacers to create the 2mm joints that'll be filled with epoxy resin. Gone are the days of arranging the segments in a large template. Now I found it much better to superglue each segment directly into the spacers. Care has to be taken to get everything lined up in a nice snug fit, but with a bit of practice it all goes together very easily. Recently I've spent a bit of time improving the spacer design and how they're printed, and this has ended up giving much better results. Also, my older projects had 18 segments in each ring, but that amount was a bit fiddly on smaller things like this. So now I use 12 segments, and again this is an improvement. Print the spacers in different diameters. This is useful for where they're placed in the assembled unit. With a bit of forethought, they can be positioned in one of 2 ways. The first, and most preferable, is that they're completely cut out of the finished piece. The second method is to place them further in towards the centre, where they'll remain encased in epoxy resin, never to be seen again. But to be on the safe side, I always print them in the same colour as the epoxy resin I'll be using, so if they are partially uncovered, they'll blend in. That's the first base ring done. The second one is a bit different in that the segments aren't as wide. This will create a bigger void which will fill with epoxy resin. This is a deliberate move which will come into play later on. get the idea as to how the segmented base is assembled. There are 4 rings in this piece, so I'll skip ahead to the start of the last ring. The segments in the last ring are wider than the previous 3. This is to provide the transition to the wider midsection, and these are a bit trickier to set in place. After carefully supergluing the first one with a top spacer attached, I was then able to add the remaining segments. Skipping forward a little, the last 2 segments went in without any drama. There was a bit of plastic that needed to be removed, but no biggie. After a quick check, I moved on to the rim. This is just a single ring of segments, held together with 2 spacers. You can see how 2 different size spacers are used so they won't show up in the finished piece. The wider diameter spacer is used on the underside of the rim. This will be completely cut away when it's finished, as will the smaller diameter ring. This will disappear when I form the sweeping curve up from the inner midsection out towards the outer edge of the rim. Using 2 spacers in this way almost guarantees the segments will be flat and level. You just have to make sure the segments are pushed snugly against the tabs on the spacer before gluing. The base and rim are now ready to be cast in epoxy resin. A check over each confirmed all the segments were in place. For long enough I've been making do with rubbish casting moulds for the more oddly shaped castings, but not anymore. I made these 3D printed parts so I can cast a silicone mould for the base section. The blue outer piece splits down the middle and is held together with 4 dovetail clips. The joint is sealed with packing tape, which in the end turned out to be a bit of a mistake. Then both parts were waxed to aid in releasing the silicone mould. I'm not sure if this is necessary, but I did it anyway. This is the silicone I used. I'm not sure if it's any good, but the reviews looked okay on Amazon. I designed the plastic mould in CAD, so it was easy to find out the volume of silicone I would need. The figure is on screen now, which to me converts to a rounded up ½ litre. So I added 250 ml of each part to the mixing cup. This was thoroughly mixed for what seems like ages, and then it was poured into the mould. I poured half the amount into the outer mould, then added the inner mould, sank it down and added weight. Then I poured the rest into the open sides until it was full. More weight was placed on top, then the whole thing went into the pressure pot to cure overnight. Another day has passed and it's time to see if the mould has worked. With the dovetail clips removed, I began to pry the mould open, but this was easier said than done because the packing tape on the inside was holding it firmly together. After a bit of a struggle, I got one half off. The other half came away after a bit of a fight, which resulted in me breaking a chunk out of it. Outer removed, then it was just a case of unrolling the silicone mould, and there it was. It was a little rough around the edges and I had a couple of air bubbles in the base, but overall it was a great success and I learned a lot for the next time I do one. To top it off, the segmented base was a perfect fit and I had a silicone tray which was just the right size for the rim. Happy days. A couple of smaller baking trays filled the centres, and then it was time to get them both cast in epoxy resin. A quick mention for this week's sponsor, Tea Expert. They offer a range of epoxy resin products. There's a link to the website and a 10% discount code in the video description. Black mica powder was added to 3 batches of epoxy resin, and then each one was mixed for a minimum of 2 minutes. With no need to pre-cure the resin, I filled the base section with 2 batches. The rim took the final batch, then I placed both of them into the pressure pot, added 50 to 55 psi and left them overnight to cure. It's the next day and initially all looked good, but the resin in the base section had sunk, which meant it would have to be topped up and placed in the pressure pot for another overnight session. However, the rim was perfect. No open joints, cracks or voids. Having filled the base section and tucked it away till the next day, I could crack on with the rest of the bowl. Over on the drum sander, I removed the excess resin from the rim. Rim done, I sanded the 2 midsection rings and the 2 feature rings. I won't dwell on sanding these pieces, so moving on, with all the rings flat and level, I began bonding them together. I fixed the first feature ring on the lathe and added a layer of rapid setting epoxy onto a 1mm 3D printed ring. This was stuck in place, then another layer of epoxy was added, and onto this went the first midsection ring. Then I applied more epoxy and placed a second midsection ring, centered that, applied more epoxy, then positioned the second feature ring with another 1mm thick 3D printed ring sandwiched between them. And last but not least, the rim, bonded with more rapid setting epoxy, with another 3D printed 1mm thick ring sandwiched between it and the Sapele and Maple feature ring. I used a tool rest to help centre the rim, and then it was left to cure. It's now a few days later, the base section is cured and it's ready to be flattened, but with the mid-upper section on the lathe, I opted to use the drum sander. And I'm pleased to say the silicone mould that I made has been a great success. I'll do a video detailing full process when I make the next one. The sanding went okay. There was a fair bit to remove, and I had to hold it steady until I got a good level surface, but I think you've seen enough of this for one video, so moving on, the midsection was on the lathe, needing some attention. I was hoping to get this cleaned up and rough turned, but the chuck didn't have the best grip. I didn't realise this for a start, and the more I went at it, the worse it got. I wanted to get the inside of the rim cleaned up so I could centre the blank on the coal jaws. The outer diameter was too big, but it just wasn't to be. As soon as the carbide touched the resin on the inside of the rim, the blank was knocked off centre, so I had to give up on that idea, and I decided to fix the base in the coal jaws and cut a mortise. Then I could work on that piece once it was fixed on the 4-jaw chuck. The mortise was cut in the usual way. First, the 1/4 inch parting tool was used to define the outer edge and cut down to around 6mm, 1/4 inch. Then the dovetail tool to cut the dovetail, the gouge to clean out the centre, and then the skew to tidy up the recess and add a bit of decoration. Then I sanded to 400 grit and added a lacquer finish, which I didn't film. So moving on, with the blank turned around, I could begin cutting away the waste material. and exposed the segmented rings underneath. This was another plus point for using a custom silicone mould. There was very little epoxy resin to cut through. It seemed like it only needed a few swipes of the negative rate carbide to uncover the sapele underneath. Having got most of the segments uncovered, I went straight into forming the cutout. The segments in the second ring were sacrificial. Their only purpose was to create a void for the black resin to fill, and I was keen to get them removed to expose what was underneath. I went at it for a good couple of minutes, but the inky blackness was nowhere to be seen, so I packed that up for a while and cleaned out the top inner part, levelled the top and got it ready for the upper section to be glued in place. The inside cleaned up quite nicely, and the top surface just needed a bit of fettling, and then I glued the top on with rapid setting epoxy, not forgetting to sandwich a 1mm spacer between the two blanks. A few swift taps with a hammer centred the blanks with one another, then I made sure the joints lined up top to bottom, and then I left it for 20 minutes for the epoxy to cure. The midsection was mostly sapele and maple, so the bowl gouge seemed appropriate to start removing the waste material. Slowly I began to cut into the segmented rings, and I'm always impressed at how well the maple slices off the blank. The target point for the first round was to get down to the same level as the top sapele ring in the base. From there, I would be able to develop the design. Shear scraping the surface got me most of the way to where I wanted to be, and after a bit of work under the rim, I switched to the negative rate carbide. I find it easier to use it when I'm forming the curves under the rim and where the midsection blends down into the base. The carbide got the underside of the rim roughed in and blended into the midsection, and after a quick check I could still see flat unworked spots in the maple, so there was a bit of a way to go to clean that up, but it was the lower part of the bowl that was giving me the most concern. I wasn't sure if there was enough material to work with. The part I was having difficulty with was the bit directly under the top sapele ring in the base. There was a big step. I should have made the third ring wider to soften the transition down into the cutout, but it was a bit late to think about it now. I would have to work with what I had. I removed as much material as I dared to, then moved down to the foot and started working my way into the cutout. It was now that I got my first glimpse of the solid epoxy resin core. The thing that would save me was how much deeper I could make the cutout. Using carbide and parting tool, I uncovered the black resin core, praying it wasn't cracked, and apart from a couple of blemishes, it was okay. The main thing was, with it opened up, I could see a shape coming together that I would be okay with. Happy that I could move on, the foot needed some work, so that was next. After adding a step into the foot to soften the thickness of the sapele segments, I turned to blending the top two rings into the resin core. I chose to do this with the carbide, which wouldn't chip the resin joints and core. I filled the blemishes in the resin with black super glue and sprayed it with an activator, then I set about blending and fairing the surface. And that was the outer surface more or less done. I felt the foot and lower section needed a bit more work, but that could wait till later. I sanded with 80 grit to check for tool marks, and then I began hollowing out the inside. Whilst I could, I left the tailstock support in place and started to form the curve down into the bowl, but soon enough I had to get deeper into the rest of the waste material. With the tailstock out of the way, I used the carbide to cut away the maple and sapele. I didn't want to go straight in with a gouge for fear of getting a catch, and this way I could judge how well the four-jaw chuck was gripping the mortise. As you can see, the hollowing out went very quickly. It always does with segmented projects, there just isn't a lot to remove. And what follows is just more of the same, so I'll skip ahead to where the inside is almost done. And here we are. I blended and faired the inside with a small negative rate scraper and used the skew to remove the last few tool marks from the rim. And that was it done. I sanded from 80 to 800 grit, and then I cleaned away the dust inside and out with denatured alcohol. Next I applied 2 coats of sanding sealer, each one denibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. And that was it for my usual finishing process. Next I had to mask off the rim, both the feature rings and the base. For this I used a low tack masking tape. What I'm trying to do here is get the tape to just cover the black ring, leaving the maple midsection free and clear. That done, it was just a case of masking the rest off so it didn't get any spray on it. All taped up, it was ready for the primer, in this case made by Montana. I applied 2 coats and left it 45 minutes to dry. Next I applied Montana white. The white references the gloss finish. The colour is in fact ancient white. This paint and Montana gold are the only 2 types you can use with a Crackle effect paint. In total, I applied 3 coats. After another 45 minutes, I sprayed the Crackle effect paint. I did 1 heavy-ish coat. The thinner it's sprayed, the finer the effect, and I wanted a fairly coarse crackle. The colour is copper brown. Once the paint is applied, there's nothing to do except watch it do its thing. The following is speeded up 10 times normal speed. As fascinating as this is to watch, it has to be left for 24 hours before the clear varnish top coat can be applied. It's the next day, and after a night in the warm house, the masking tape can be removed. I was in 2 minds as to whether I should have done this whilst the paint was still wet, but in the end, doing it this way didn't create any problems. The tape came away, leaving crisp, clear edges. This is much better than my previous attempt. I really like the effect, and the colour match isn't too bad either. After a quick wipe down, I sprayed the Montana semi-gloss varnish. I applied a light first coat, both inside and out, and left it for 5 minutes between coats. 2 to 3 coats are recommended, so I applied 3. Between coats 2 and 3, I used a 1200 grit abrasive. This was done to take away some of the rougher spots. I wasn't sure if it would work, but it did. The last coat turned out silky smooth. That's it, another project finished, and what a job that was. The whole thing took the equivalent of 4 days to make and edit the video, but it was worth it. I like it a lot, and I hope you like it too. This is going on my favourite shelf. The paint effect turned out so much better than I could have hoped for, and the Sapele and Maple toned perfectly with the copper brown paint. I have some more Crackle paint on the way, so you'll be seeing more projects like this in the future. With that said, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Please subscribe. A thumbs up will be greatly appreciated, and comments are always welcome. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.